首先代表东吴大学哲学系，谢谢杜凯婷教授来到东吴大学给我们做这场演讲啊。杜凯婷教授，我在美国第一次见到他，上次还一起吃饭，就是上个月的时候啊，2个月，将近1个月前。那也很感谢马凯之老师，特别把杜教授邀请到我们东吴大学来，我才有这个机会啊。那今天讲的题目是徐复观人性论。事实上，徐复观的哲学思想长期以来在台湾是比较被忽略的。一般来说，大家把徐复观先生的这个学术思想定位在思想史方面。那做思想史跟哲学史有距离，那么跟纯粹做哲学方面的距离也稍微远了点。事实上，做中国思想史的这些学者，常常也对哲学方面、哲学这个领域有很多的这个见解。也许这个做当代新儒家的比较集中在牟宗三跟唐君毅2位先生的哲学里头啊。那我自己也犯了这个毛病。那说不定今天可以听到杜教授给我们带来一些新的刺激。马凯之老师很辛苦的把这些联系好，我也请马凯之老师向大家介绍一下杜教授。好，
谢谢沈老师。对，我想对，大家好，对各位同学好，我想我也不需要讲太多，就是我是非常高兴David今天能够来我们这个东吴大学这个中国哲学外文资料中心来做一场演讲。那我们很期待这个题目啊，我们这个演讲系列已经进行了很久啊，就是将近2年多啊，2年了。那但是我们关于这个牟宗三、徐复观、唐君毅啊，就是20世纪的中国哲学史或者中国思想史的，在中国哲学上比较杰出的学者方面的报告不多啊，还不多啊，所以我们今天很期待这场演讲。那这个杜老师啊 ，David Elstein 是在 University of Michigan 拿到博士啊，然后现在在纽约啊，纽约的这个Paltz 的这个任教啊，然后他这个哲学兴趣也蛮广啊，他是一边就是有汉学的训练啊，所以一边对这个中文的资料啊，对中国思想史啊、中国哲学史有兴趣啊，然后同时也对哲学啊、当代啊，特别是当代的伦理学啊、当代的这个政治哲学啊颇感兴趣啊，所以他这方面的论文也很多啊，那很多论文也就是在这个聚焦在这个新儒家方面的讨论啊，所以他有写过一篇文章，2010年你可以这个提一下，在那个 Journal of Comparative Philosophy 写过一篇叫做 Why Early Confucianism Cannot Generate Democracy 这样的一篇文章，就是为什么早期的儒学啊，就是先秦儒学无法就是开出民主这样的一篇文章。你们听到开出民主，然后这4个字，都可能已经心目中已经可能会联想到牟宗三开出民主，说的这个儒家是否能开出民主啊？这样一个问题意识也都受到很多20世纪的华人啊学者的关注啊，是一个蛮热门的一个研究议题。所以这个 democracy 啊，就是民主与这个儒家传统或者是东方的精神传统之间的可能关联，以及潜在冲突啊，一直是杜教授的一个研究啊，他所关注的一个议题啊。我想这方面的杜老师的这个见解都蛮独特的啊，而且他后来有2014年，就是去年出版了一本《Democracy and Contemporary Confucian Philosophy》这样一本书啊，也可以逐一说明他对这个问题浓厚兴趣啊，所以我想我们就热烈欢迎啊，然后再次也去鼓掌一下，然后
谢谢马老师、沈老师，客气的欢迎，谢谢这个机会为东吴大学来做这次演讲。然后我从此开始就用英文讲。So thank you for having me, giving me this opportunity to share this topic with you. As Professor Shen already said, I do think that there is a great deal of interest in Xu Fuguan's thought, although he himself did not call himself a philosopher, and at times denied that he was doing philosophy. I think there really is a great deal of philosophical interest in there that is worth more attention than it usually gets, even in the Chinese-speaking world, and of course, in the English-speaking world, most people have no idea who he is. So I'm attempting to rectify that through this project, which I will present a small piece of today. So here's the basic structure of what I want to go through today. Hope I'll have time to get to everything. But in addition to being a very interesting thinker, I also find him a fascinating person. He has such an unusual background for a scholar, of course, being a general in the Kuomintang army, personally acquainted with not only Jiang Jieshi, but also Mao Zedong, really much more deeply involved in the politics of the time than most of the other philosophers were. And I think this shaped a great deal of his thought and his reaction to the political events of the time, and it's really worth paying some attention to that. And then, as the title indicates, what I want to focus on mostly is his theory of human nature. Of course, he is a Xinlujia, and that means he accepts the Mengzi's idea that human nature is good, but I find his interpretation of that very interesting, and especially compared to somebody like Mo Zhongshan, it's perhaps a little bit easier for people like me to accept, or other modern people for whom Mo Zhongshan, the metaphysics is a little bit heavy sometimes. And Xu Fuguan, I think, doesn't completely get away from that, but he tries to, and I think gives some interesting directions to think about human nature in a way that can avoid some of the metaphysical problems that Mo Zhongshan perhaps has. And then a question that I find particularly interesting is, how do we know human nature is good? And this is one area where I find myself differing from contemporary Taiwanese interpretations, which again tend to be heavily influenced by Mo Zhongshan. So I've had some discussions during this visit with some Taiwanese scholars, such as Yang Zuhan and Li Minhui, about this question, and I must say I find their answers not entirely satisfying. So I will share with you where I think how Xu Fuguan attempts to answer this question, and where I think he really should have tried to answer this question in a way that I'll explain why I think this is a more promising approach. And then finally, the focus on practice is a very crucial aspect. And then the connection with politics is very important, because again, as I said before, this is really a philosophy and a way of thinking that is very much responsive to political events of the 50s and 60s in Taiwan and in China as well. So, a little bit of background. As I imagine most people know, he was born in a relatively poor family, and largely in order to make a living, ended up joining the army, and eventually went to Japan for military school, but in 1937 came back after the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, and then eventually worked his way up to a general in the Kuomintang army, was a personal aide to Jiang Jieshi for a while, and as you read some of his biographical writings, he's extremely critical of Kuomintang in the 50s. And yet, for some reason, Jiang Jieshi seemed to like him and sort of let him do this. And in fact, financially supported his journal. He published a journal called Minzhu Pingguan for quite a while, and this was subsidized by Jiang Jieshi. So although he was very critical of Jiang politically, personally, they seemed to get along reasonably well. And he was initially very interested in a lot of the new thought that was being translated at the time, a lot of it in Japanese and then into Chinese, but eventually became very critical of a lot of this Western discourse that was becoming very popular in the 20s and 30s after the May 4th period. And After he came to Taiwan and Hong Kong, he continued arguing with a lot of the liberals, people like Zhang Guoquan, Yin Haiguang, Wu Shi. One very entertaining thing about Xinru Jia is, man, they did not like Wu Shi. This comes out very clearly. He had some interesting things to say, although he and Yin Haiguang were very good friends. But they really disagreed about although they agreed about democracy, they really disagreed about the political and philosophical foundation of democracy. He was involved in some of the debates about scientism, sort of taking scientific knowledge as the standard for all knowledge. So again, this was a group that was a lot of people at Beida. Jiang Junmai was involved, and some of this continued on in Taiwan as well. He was very much opposed to that. And then, of course, communism, like the other, Xinru Jia was very much opposed to that. And he ended up making a very strong defense of some aspects of traditional Chinese culture. He had some criticisms. He agreed that some things needed to change, but he felt it was very important that the tradition of thought did continue in some fashion. And this is largely due to his meeting with Xiongshi Li. This made a big impression on him. He writes about his account. He wrote a letter to Xiongshi Li asking to meet him. This was, I think, in the early 30s, 1932, 1933 maybe. So after Xiongshi Li had published the Xinlu Shilun and started becoming very famous, Xu Fuguan wrote to him asking to have a meeting, and Xiongshi Li wrote back to him and said, "Your handwriting is terrible." And this is a very disrespectful way to write a letter to a more senior scholar. Xu apologized and wrote him another letter. And eventually Xiong agreed to meet him, and in this meeting Xu writes that Xiong, you don't know how to read. Your way of reading books is way too shallow. You don't understand anything. Every book has something worthwhile in it, and you have to read to find what's good in the book, and only then do you understand it. And he writes that this made a big impression on him. And he started reading thread-bound books again after nearly 20 years. He'd been reading a lot of Marxism, liberalism, Western economics, had no interest in traditional Chinese books, and after this meeting with Xiongshi Li, he completely changed. And then, of course, around this time, he got to know Tang Junyi, Mo Zhongshan very well as well. They were all good friends. And throughout his career, he was very strong in his defense of the value of individual freedom in a certain way, not exactly in a liberal way. But this was very important to him, and his criticisms of communism and the Kuomintang policy in Taiwan were largely based on his view of the importance of individual choice, and that's something that I'll get more into as I go along. So what I'm going to be talking about is mostly drawn from 中国人性论史先秦篇, although not exclusively. But in this book, he talks about Chinese thought as a form of humanism, 人文主义. And in part, he wants to defend the value of humanistic studies, like philosophy, intellectual history, and he's concerned about the effects of this scientism, and specifically its effects on morality and values, which he thinks are not something that can be scientifically demonstrated. And it's very important to have a sense of value in what he calls spiritual life, 精神生活. And that scientism does not give place for this. He characterizes Chinese thought as lacking external transcendence. So, 内在的超越性, 但是没有外在的超越性. And he distinguishes that with Western thought, and specifically religious thought, which relies on a God, which is the source of the universe and the creator of all life and so on. And even non-religious forms of metaphysical thought, he thinks are inappropriate to apply to Chinese thought. So although he doesn't criticize Mo Zhongshan or Tang Jimi by name, I think Yan Wai Zhi Yi, if you will, is that the kinds of projects they're engaged in are really not appropriate for understanding Chinese thought. So at one point, obviously everyone can read Chinese, so I don't need to read the quote, but using Western metaphysics as a way of understanding Chinese thought really leads to misunderstandings. He does specifically mention Hegelian metaphysics as inappropriate, and this is probably a dig at Tang Jimi. And I think he also has in mind the kind of Kantian ontology that Mo Zhongshan was engaged in, that this is really not what Chinese thought is about, and it leads to misunderstandings. He's very clear that science does play an important role, and if to understand the physical world, that is something that in the 20th century is a scientific project, not a philosophical project. So in this little piece he mentions Yu Zhou Lun, but it's really more than just cosmology or Yu Zhou Lun in the narrow sense, but about all kinds of explanations of the physical world. This is not a philosophical project. What philosophy does, he thinks, is explain value and understanding value through practice specifically. So even now, there are a number of scholars of Chinese philosophy who are concerned with Chinese philosophy becoming theory and not leading to practice. In Taiwan, for example, Lin Anwu talks about this a lot. And Xu was also very concerned about this early on. Chinese philosophy fundamentally cannot be understood in a theoretical way. It's something you have to realize in your life. So this is an illustrative quote where he talks about realizing something and understanding something through practice, which as someone who does philosophy professionally gives me something to reflect about. But how does this actually apply to life? This is something that's been prominent in the whole tradition of Chinese thought, is concerned with practice. And in his book, 中国人性论史, he traces a development of Chinese thought from a religious way of thinking to a humanistic or secular way of thinking. And here again he differs from some other contemporary Xinrujia who do talk about Confucianism as a kind of religion. Du Weiming, for example, or Liu Shuxian will emphasize the religious aspects more. Liang Shuning also. And he really said Confucianism, when you get to Mengzi, Zhongyong Daxue, the real core, what he thinks of as the core of Confucianism, this is not a religious way of thinking. And this is because he's got a very particular understanding of religion. He really thinks of religion as something like Christianity, where it involves an external transcendent source of value that human beings have to conform to. When he talks about religion, that he means something like that. So in the traditional Western religions, God is the source of morality and the source of value. If God commands something, that's what people should do. And he's very strongly opposed to that way of thinking because he thinks it makes true morality impossible. If the locus of value and choice is something external to human beings, in his mind, there is no morality. So, for example, he says this: to think of someone else as responsible for my choices and my actions. I abandon any sense of personal responsibility, then there is no possibility of morality. What he thinks happens in the history of Chinese thought into the later Zhou period is a change from looking to an outside source for decisions. And so he'll talk about Shang religion and divination, where the Shang were looking to Di, or looking to ancestors to make choices for them. That's what divination is doing, is asking someone, is this what we should do? And the great contribution of Kongzi, Mengzi, Xunzi not so much maybe, is to point out that we are responsible for our choices and we have to face that reality. He doesn't talk about Sartre very often. I've just come across one or two references. But in this respect, I think he kind of agrees that the reality of human life is choice. Not in the way that Sartre does exactly, but that we can't give responsibility for our actions to someone else or to some transcendent source. And instead, what developed in Chinese thought is what he called concerned consciousness, 忧患意识. This is kind of the famous slogan that he became very well known for. Mo Zhongshan credits him with inventing this. And this comes from the I Ching. And here's how he described it. It's facing the reality that we are responsible for our own actions, and we have to be responsible for the consequences of our choices, and acting in a manner consistent with that. This is what humanism means. It is recognizing and accepting this responsibility, and this is what makes morality possible. When people are conscious of their choices and take responsibility for their choices, then we can ascribe moral value to their actions. We can say they're good or bad. So what Kongzi, what Mengzi did is make morality possible. And this is why he has such great respect for them. Now, the key part of this is this concept of human nature, 人性. And here again, he believes there's a change in how this was understood. And this connects to this concerned consciousness, because it's this idea of human nature which makes moral choice possible. So he describes how this evolved over time. Now, I'm not going to go into whether, as intellectual history, this is strictly correct. For what I'm interested in, that's not the most important question, but how he understands it. But in his mind, there's a transformation from heteronymous thinking to autonomous thinking. 由他律转成自律, although he doesn't actually use the term 自律 ever, as far as I know. I've seen. But that's more or less what he means. He says the early concept of human nature, 人性就是本能. 人性 is like a set of instinctual drives that human beings happen to have, that other animals also have. The specifics are different. What human beings want to eat and what cows want to eat are not the same thing. But that feeling of hunger and drive to eat something is not different. And this is what he attributes to Gaozi in Mengzi, Gaozi Shangtian. So when Gaozi says 生之谓性, it's like these instinctual drives that all animals have. That's what 性 is. Right? And if you remember your Mengzi, of course Mengzi disagrees with Gaozi about this. Because what Mengzi is defending is that 性 is not what human beings have in common with animals, but what's different. Mengzi wants to focus on what's uniquely human, not what we share with animals. And here I think Xu's right, that this is what Mengzi really focuses on. And what he thinks is different from animals is that moral capacity. So for example, Mengzi says, the way in which we are different from animals is very small, very subtle. It's not that we have desires of the senses. We see things, hear things, smell things. We have certain desires in response. So Mengzi says the Junzi does not regard these as human nature. Junzi, the Wei Xing. It's the four sprouts, 四端. That's what we regard as properly human nature, because that's what animals don't have. Now, animals, at best, have a limited capacity. Certain kinds of animals, the parents will care for their children, like dogs will care for the puppies, but it's not on the scope that human beings can have. We can care about the entire human species. We care about non-human animals. We care about plants. We have these moral responses in a much vaster scope than any other animal does, at least as far as we know. That's what human nature is. So, like other Xinrujia, it's really important for Xu that morality is autonomous, that one acts in a self-driven manner. So although he doesn't use 自律, he does use 自主, or self-mastery, because we have to choose our actions to have moral responsibility. And we do that when we act on the true self, and desires are not the true self. So to this extent, he does have a kind of Kantian picture of a self, where there are desires or inclinations, 爱好, and we don't want to act on those necessarily. And then there's a true self, and the true self 就是四端, 四心, 本心, he uses all these terms. Because the new Confucians were basically all accepted this idea of Kant that desires cannot be the source of morality. Acting on desires is heteronymous, it can never be autonomous. Although he does have a somewhat more subtle view of desire. If you look at 生命理学, they're almost always very negative about desires. Desires are bad and should be eliminated. 私欲, always bad. And Xu is a little bit more nuanced. The desires aren't bad. We're physical beings, we have to eat, we have to breathe, we have to drink. We have certain kinds of desires that we can't get rid of, and there's nothing wrong with them. Wanting to eat is not a bad thing. But these are not the source of moral actions. But of course, where he disagrees with Kant, for Kant, morality means acting on reason. And for Xu, reason is not the source of moral value either. It has a certain use, which I'll get to in a little bit, but it's not the source of morality. So the divide is not reason versus inclination as it is in Kant, but it's drawn in a different way. I'm not sure, although I think it's possible that he may have been influenced by Hegel's criticism of Kant. Hegel criticized Kant's categorical imperative for being empty formalism and not being able to generate any moral decisions. And since his friend Tang Jini was very interested in Kant, he may have known about this, although again, I haven't seen him bring it up. But when you have this view of human nature, as Confucians do, that human nature is good, this question of how we know is, to me, a really crucial question. And certainly when I teach Mengzi to American students, they are almost invariably skeptical. They've grown up with these views of evolution and that people are naturally selfish and just want to propagate their genes. And in this environment, to tell people that human nature is good it's a bit of a challenge. So I'm very interested in this question of how they try to argue for this. And I think he or she has some really interesting things to say. So he believes that the mind, Xin, I'll talk about mind or heart-mind, has two kind of distinct faculties. There's 知心 and there's 德性. Of course, he's not the only one to make this distinction. 知心, I would probably translate as cognition, although it really needs to be a little bit narrower than that. But he means a kind of intellectual cognition, although like sense perception would be included in this as well. And then 德性 is something fundamentally different, kind of moral awareness, moral responsiveness. He does, I think, endorse a kind of separation of fact and value. In that, and some of this also relates to, for example, some of the differences between Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming about the sources of motivation. But he believes that knowing facts alone does not motivate action. For example, if we know there are children starving somewhere in the world, knowing that fact by itself does not get me to do anything about it. And knowing more facts doesn't necessarily solve that problem. So it's not a matter of lacking knowledge or needing more knowledge. Value is something different. It's just a distinct category. So in this respect, I think he sides with Wang Yangming in terms of the importance of motivation as opposed to facts. But he's also concerned to respond to liberals, Zhang Fuquan, Yin Haiguang notably, who accused Confucianism of being pan-moralism, 反道德主义. I believe Zhang Fuquan created this term in Chinese, and it became a kind of standard liberal criticism of Confucianism. And as Zhang Fuquan, Yin Haiguang, Wei Zhengtong use this, they think Confucianism made moral value the standard for everything. So all kinds of value get subordinated to moral value. Knowledge has no independent value. Aesthetics has no independent value. If something is not morally good, it is not good at all. And they believe this is why China didn't develop science, because scientific knowledge in itself did not have value, did not value the arts properly, because things weren't judged merely on an aesthetic basis, but were judged morally. So, Zhang Fuquan and Ziyou Yurenquan made this criticism. Yin Haiguang made it in several writings. And although, at least in 中国人性论史, Xu doesn't talk about them or doesn't talk about 反道德主义. He was at Donghai Daxue with Zhang Fuquan. He certainly knew about this. And I think he's very motivated to try to respond to this criticism. He does so by saying, well, knowledge is important. We do need knowledge, scientific knowledge specifically, but knowledge more generally, because it'll do two things. First, we need instrumental reason. To be able to realize our intentions effectively, we have to know how. And this is one thing knowledge will do. It gives us knowledge about what means are going to be useful for realizing whatever goals that we have. If I want something to drink, it's good to know that I can go to 7-Eleven or I can go to Chuejia and I can buy something to drink. That will allow me to realize my intention effectively. So I need to have knowledge about the world in order to make that possible. So the more knowledge we have, the more effective we can reason in this way. So that's one reason that knowledge is important. The second function is a little bit more complicated. It's what he calls clarifying proper objects of morality. 为道的理清对象. And the example he gives, I personally find extremely unhelpful. It has to do with correct sacrifices versus incorrect sacrifices. But what I think he's getting at is that knowledge about the world gives us better understanding of what is the right object of a moral feeling. So according to Mengzi, we have the 四心 仁义礼智. And so we have kinds of moral responses to events. But they're not always correct. So the example that comes up to me is King Xuan, where this famous story in Mengzi where he sees the ox about to be killed and the ox looks innocent and he feels bad for the ox and he says, I can't bear to see it suffering. Use a sheep instead. Now Mengzi uses the story for two things. One of the lessons is the king has the capacity to be benevolent, because he did it. He responded benevolently to an indication of suffering, the suffering of the ox. So that proves he can do it. The problem that Mengzi points out is that he's doing it to the wrong thing. He's being benevolent to animals, but not to his people. And as Mengzi says, the Junzi is not benevolent to animals. So, in that same passage, Mengzi says, it is the nature of people that if they hear the cries of the animal, they can't bear to eat their flesh. And this is why the Junzi stays away from the kitchen. So he won't have to face the animals being slaughtered. And every time I read this, I think, why is the Junzi not vegetarian? But it's because animals don't have moral value for Mengzi. I mean, maybe they should, that's another question. But for him, they don't. So when the king is benevolent to animals, he is benevolent on the wrong occasion. So what knowledge can do is help direct moral responses correctly. So learning more about animals and about humans, and somehow, admittedly this is a little bit vague, this Xu thinks can direct our responses more appropriately. So we'll be benevolent to people and not benevolent to things we shouldn't be benevolent to necessarily. And here, by the way, is one major difference, I think, between Mengzi and later Songming Lishu, where people like Chen Hao or Wang Anming talk about being benevolent to everything. Zhang Zai, Junzi, Yuan Wei Ti, this kind of thing. And Mengzi, he very clearly says, don't be benevolent to animals, much less plants. The question doesn't even come up for him. So, I think he's motivated to defend knowledge in this way to address this criticism of animalism. And he uses this to analyze other Confucian philosophers. His response to this is, yeah, science is really important. It's valuable. This is knowledge that we have to pursue. And so, for example, he thinks Zhu Xi got this right. Zhu Xi talks about qiong li, and you qiong the li of everything. Everything is worth investigating and worth studying. And he says that it's unfortunate that later followers of Zhu Xi did not develop this and sort of forgot about this side of Zhu Xi, and later on, Ming-Qing dynasty, it became this very sterile kind of scholastic memorizing Zhu Xi and not actually taking Zhu Xi's advice and studying the li of everything. And he's actually quite critical of Wang Yanming for not recognizing the importance of knowledge. Wang really does very clearly subordinate knowledge to morality. Wang says things like, it's worth investigating how to take care of one's parents, how to keep them cool in the summer and warm in the winter. These li should all be investigated, but only when it helps you fulfill some kind of moral purpose. Thinks Wang didn't recognize the importance of knowledge enough, and Zhu Xi got that right. So he says it's not just xingli that need to be investigated. We need to investigate shili and wuli as well. So the patterns of everything, at least potentially. However, at the end of the day, he really doesn't separate them. When Zhang Fuoquan and Yi Haiguang talk about pan-moralism, they want knowledge and morality to be independent. So we pursue knowledge of any kind. It doesn't need to have a moral purpose. Maybe it's even potentially immoral. For them, it doesn't seem to matter. All knowledge is worth pursuing. And where Xu seems to be pointing is that knowledge is worth pursuing because it will help our moral action be better directed. And he does say, in practice, these are not separated. These cannot be distinguished. So, knowledge and morality are not two distinct categories, which I think really does say to the pan-moralist criticism, yeah, this is true. And in that respect, I think he really is kind of a pan-moralist. But that doesn't mean knowledge is unimportant. Although then you get into difficult questions about what knowledge is important and how important is it compared to other kinds of knowledge, but that would take us too far afield. Now, because he separates zhixing and dexing, then this question of how we know human nature becomes very difficult. Because he really thinks of these as completely distinct faculties with distinct objects. Zhixing applies to what is external, 外在. Dexing is 内在. This is internal. And we just can't have knowledge or cognition of what is internal. Like, I can't see inside my own body, metaphorically speaking. Now, human nature, this is internal. And this means that this is just not something that we can scientifically prove. But then we have the following kinds of problems. Does it not exist? Because then we get into the hazard of relativism or nihilism. And And this is something I see a lot among my students. Relativism of a very naive sort is extremely common. Well, whatever people think is good is good. I get this a lot. Because what standard could there be if you can't scientifically prove something? Or even worse, we deny that value exists at all and have some kind of moral nihilism. And Xu notes these dangers. But what else is there? Do we just have some kind of belief, faith that human nature is good? And where I think there's a little bit more than that. He thinks there's more than that, and he tries to show that there's more than that. And this is one very interesting aspect of his philosophy for me. So he's got a few different ways to try to argue for the goodness of human nature. And I'll just point to two important ones. One is we have a universal preference for virtue. 美德为人所同有，不以为人所同好。We all prefer virtuous behavior in other people, specifically. This is why government by virtue is possible. 孔子、孟子 say, if you are a true king, you practice benevolent government, people will move to your state, right? People will realize this, appreciate it, and want to live under that kind of government. Because that's what people actually prefer. I think he doesn't emphasize this point enough. This is not just a political point, that people prefer rulers who care for their interests. Would that we could have some. Yes, people do prefer that. But this point is much deeper. Don't look at what people say they will do or what they want to do for themselves. People are horrible rationalizers. Look at what people want other people to do. Look at the demands we make in others. We all want people to be honest with us, to respect us, to not steal from us, to not hurt us. When it comes for our own actions, we're really good at coming up with some excuse. Like, well, in this case, I have to lie because the consequences would be really bad. But we still want people to be honest with us. So in the Analects, Kongzi talks about 恕己所不欲，勿施于人 as a kind of moral standard. Now, it has its own difficulties. It can run into problems. But as a general guideline, you could do a lot worse. If we are all equal, we make moral demands on others, can we not try to live up to those ourselves? Now, of course, the immediate objection one can make is that just because we make moral demands of other people doesn't prove that they can live up to them. Maybe it's not possible. How would we know? Xu does seem to assume that this universal preference for virtue that we have can be realized. It is actually possible. Do we have good reason to believe that? All right, so here I'm going to depart from Xu Fuguan a little bit, and I'm going to give you a little bit of Dukaiting philosophy, because here's where I think he should go. I think he has to admit, yeah, this is not proof. I can't prove that other people can actually fulfill and meet the demands that I make of them. But maybe we don't have to. Because here it really depends on who you look at. So here's Mengzi. 无恻隐之心，非人也. One way of reading this, and the way I like to read it, recognizes that there may be some people who don't have these. And if so, 从生物学的角度来看是人，从道德的角度来看非人。They are not fully human, if there are such people. On the other hand, there's Wang Yang. And this is long, so I won't go through the whole thing. But he really seems to say everybody can do this. 大人小人 doesn't matter. These capacities really are universal. There we run into a great deal of difficulty. And this is why Mo Zhongshan and Li Minghui and Li Xinjia insist on an a priori method. Because how else could you prove a universal claim like this? You can't. But is it really universal? And this is the kind of thing that I've been bringing up these past few months and trying to explain why I see this as a problem and not always very successfully. Is this really universal? Psychologists recognize a category of people, in English we call them sociopaths, I don't know the Chinese word. But the definition is basically people 缺乏自信, they have no moral responses. They see someone getting hurt and they just don't care or laugh about it. They think it's entertaining. They don't feel compassion for the suffering of other people. And my view is, let's admit there are such people. It's a shame, it's a tragedy, but maybe it does happen. Whether it's they're born that way or because of their upbringing, whatever it is. But how many are there? Because we don't assume when we meet someone new that they're a sociopath who has no moral responsiveness. The general presumption we make is that people have some level of concern. And that's why we treat people like people and not like things. We assume people have a sense of responsibility that they can live up to, which is why we expect them to do so and why we get upset when they don't. So in philosophy of action, very often people distinguish actions and events. Actions are the result of a choice. A human choice, possibly an animal choice, depending on your views about animals, but a decision was involved. And events were things just happen. And events we don't respond to in the same way. We may get disappointed or upset, but when I want to go Hashan and it rains, I don't get angry. How could you do this to me? It's too bad. But nobody made it happen. It just happened. But when someone fails to live up to a promise they made to me, I get mad. I say, why did you do this? And that very act of holding that person responsible entails that I think they can. They could have done otherwise. And that's the way we tend to assume people are. So, my view is this is not a proof. But it's the way we can make sense of how we interact with other people. We treat them like people and not like things. When my cell phone breaks, I don't get mad at it. I go get it fixed. But when someone breaks a promise to me, my immediate response is not go to the doctor, you're broken. I attribute moral responsibility to them. So again, this part's not Xu. This part is Du Xiansheng de Zhe. Right? I think this is where he should go. Second, what he calls Tiren. So go back to the child about to fall into a well, the mountain. Famous example. when seeing a child about to fall into a well, everyone would have a certain kind of reaction. 恻隐之心. And Mung's is very careful about this example. It's a great example. It's not due to self-interest. It's not my own child. It's the child of a stranger. It's not because I want to get rewarded. This is just my immediate response to an innocent child about to be injured, if not killed. I have this moment of, And Mung's thinks everybody's going to have that. Or at least almost everybody. Maybe not literally everybody. So we have, in these cases, an immediate affective response, which is physiological. Right? Think about this situation. Your heart starts beating faster. Your body produces some adrenaline. We really respond to this. And for Xu, it's important that this is something that doesn't transcend the body. So, again, I think he's kind of pointing at Mo Zhongshan here. This is not something that is separate from the physiology of the body. These affective responses are within us. So he refers to his view as 不是形而上学，是形而中学. The Xin he's talking about is the human body. It's an embodied response. And since I have some issues with Mo Zhongshan's metaphysics, I really like this part. But here's another objection. When we're talking about affective responses, I have direct, immediate awareness of my own, but not to other people's. I can't feel what they feel. So how do I know when someone else sees a child about to fall into a well, they feel the same thing that I feel? Well, first, we tend to assume that people's reactions are similar. Right? So Mungza says, he gives these examples of taste in food, taste in beauty, and he concludes, does the Xin alone not have these? Is this a proof? No, it's not a proof. It's an assumption, but it's an assumption that's backed up with experience. Where does this come from? Well, for me, and here's where I disagree with Li Minghui, Yang Zuhan, and these people, this is not an a priori conclusion. This is something that's based on empirical evidence. How do we know people prefer the same things in food? We look at what people like to eat. Of course, now we have to be careful what level are we talking about. Because, when I'm in Taiwan for a while, 我开始很想念 cheese. Maybe not everybody likes cheese. I tend to also like some very strong smelling and flavored cheese. Many Asian people don't. Taiwanese people, you go to America or Europe for a while, maybe you're going to 开始想念臭豆腐. I will not. I will never miss chou tofu. So it's not that we have very specific flavors in common. A lot of that's cultural and what we're used to. But fats, sweets, salt, just about everybody likes those. And there are good reasons why. These are difficult to get. We need fats to survive. And so we look at every culture, what people eat for special occasions. It's usually meat. It tastes good. Even if you're vegetarian, it still tastes good. You may choose not to eat it for other reasons. But this is something we know by observing what people actually like to eat. And I think the way we know that people's affective responses are the same is by looking at what people do and how they behave. And that this is not a priori, but this is something that is based on empirical knowledge. But it's not a proof. But if you want scientific proof, I mean, here I agree with Xu. You can't have it. It's not possible. I cannot scientifically demonstrate that every single human being has identical or similar moral responses. Maybe tomorrow we'll find evidence to the contrary. But I don't think we necessarily need proof. What Xu can give us with these arguments is reason to believe this is not just made up. And this is something I'd be happy to talk about more, but I think here's where scientific evidence can actually be really helpful. Finally, practice. One reason he doesn't refer to himself as a philosopher is that he doesn't like turning Chinese thought into a theory. So the kind of work that Mo Zhongshan and Tang Junyi were doing is really not what Chinese thought is about. It's about finding and understanding this through practice in life. So he talks about 现实生活. You gotta feel it through experience, through practice. And it's another indication of this distinction between fact and value. And you could have a great moral theory. It could be true. You could believe it. But that doesn't necessarily make you a better person. You've got to live it and practice it. So, metaphysics, not useful. How do you practice metaphysics? So he doesn't talk about it. That's what we have science for. That's not what philosophy is about. Philosophy is about realizing things in your life in a continual process of refinement. So in my view, and I recognize there's room for debate here, to me, he's saying sagehood is not something you achieve once and you're done. This is a process. Similarly for benevolence, this is something you've always got to be working on in life. So he talks about unlimited responsibilities. And if we truly have unlimited responsibilities, the work is never done. You can never completely fulfill all of them. But you got to be trying. So this is what philosophy is for. To be actually realizing things in practice in life. Which again, as someone who spends a lot of time on theory, gives me some food for reflection. I'm going to skip over this because I'll save a little bit of time, but happy to answer questions about it. So, for me, here's what I think is really interesting and valuable about Xu Fuguan and why I think he deserves more attention. He is less metaphysical and can avoid a lot of the problems that I think Mo Zhongshan runs into. The kind of project that Mo is trying to do with this Liang Ceng de Cunyou Lun, I'm very skeptical about it. And Xu doesn't have that problem. We're really not talking about founding some kind of specific ontology for ethics. And to me, that's an advantage because I tend to be suspicious of ontology as a 21st century American. However, he is still buying the Kantian story a little bit. So he'll talk about morality being 超经验 and I'm never quite sure what he means by that. But I think a better interpretation of